All right, welcome into another Front Office Sports webinar here on Friday, May 31st, the end of May, jumping into June. I know a lot of summer plans ahead, so for everyone joining us, really appreciate that you guys. We have a great panel today, and we're going to be talking about committing to content, how to leverage social to connect with student athletes. We have two platforms represented in Facebook and in Twitter. We have, Opendorse represented with Blake, and then we're going to have some marketing from Zach Soskin's point of view. But I'm going to introduce the panelists or the webinar guests, and then I'm going to let them kind of give you their introduction, and then we're going to jump into some questions. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Happy to kind of connect people as we go. And then also questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or questions as well. We'll get to them probably the last 15 minutes of the webinar, but if something's super pertinent, we'll try to add it in and be super flexible. But anyways, welcome in and thanks for Opendorse for presenting this and putting this on. We're going to be joined by Zach Soskin, a grassroots marketing consultant. We have Vince Pinozzo, sports partnerships at Facebook. We have David Herman, sports partnerships at Twitter. And then we have Blake Lawrence, obviously founder and CEO at Opendorse. So fellas, I'm going to kick it off to you, let you guys introduce yourselves. We'll start with Zach.
How you guys doing? My name's Zach Soskin. So relevant to this discussion, went to University of Oregon, worked there, interned for the football recruiting department, launched the Oregon Gridiron Instagram, and ran the Twitter. It had existed, but kind of in a very different form. From that, went to Adidas, worked in social media, and then as well in grassroots football. So kind of very familiar both with social and working, hand in hand with the student athletes.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And now Vince.
How you doing? Vince Pinozzo, sports partnerships here at Facebook and Instagram, University of Miami alum. Stayed down in South Florida after graduation, spent the last 10 years working for the Miami Dolphins, leading their digital and social efforts before moving out here to join the team at Facebook. So I've been here about 5 months, and thanks for having me today.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And David.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Excited to be here. Twitter Sports Partnerships, been on our team about 3.5, I guess closer to 4 years, coming up soon enough. Work across pro and college teams, and University of Michigan grad, and excited to be part of the group today.
Awesome. And last but not least, Blake.
Blake Lawrence from Opendorse athlete marketing platform. We help nearly 7,000 athletes around the world share content on social every day. Our partners are more than 50 college athletic departments across the country and over 100 different brand partners throughout sports. So thankful for this. And then a different perspective I'm going to bring into this is 10 years ago, 12 years ago now. So pre-social media. But my little brother is just finished his freshman year at Columbia and went through the process of recruiting in the social media era, which is so different. And so I want to talk a little bit about observing his journey as a student athlete and how that impacts it, but also what we see from our partners across the country and how they're using social too. So.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Well, I'm glad to have you all and glad to have everyone who's joining us and dropping their names in the chat over there. I think, Blake, that's a natural way to get it kicked off, right? I think you can really start us off here by juxtaposing your recruiting when pre-social media to your brother's recruiting current social media and what you're kind of seeing from that standpoint. And I think we can dovetail that into some interesting conversation.
Yeah, one of the things, and not to make the center of the show about my little brother, obviously I'm proud of him. But he's a tight end out of Kansas City, a 3-star prospect, ended up with 19 Division I scholarship offers, and had, by the end of it, over 190 different coaches from D1 programs following him. And every single one of those offers started with a direct message on Twitter. And I think that gives you an indication of the importance of, from the high school athlete looking to get recruited, leveraging social to connect with coaches, but also for those coaches to stand out, because he was getting direct messages every single day from dozens of different coaches. And his feed was just full of schools trying to capture his attention. And, so from that perspective, then you flip it around and maybe I'll throw this back at you guys. Do you see this changing or growing? Like, is that the norm today? My brother is not outside the norm, I don't believe, but what are you guys seeing across the industry?
I'll chime in quickly. I think what we're seeing across the board, across platform when it comes to recruiting, and obviously many people on this call or on the webinar listening in know this far better than I do, who are in the trenches with it every day. But the key is reaching these student athletes where they are, and where they are is on our platforms, probably all day long, and maybe in some ways too much time, but they're there. And how do you begin to reach them effectively, not only individually, but also at scale? And I think that's a really interesting dynamic that we're seeing right now of recruiting departments having to spend hours and hours and days creating individual materials and graphics, but at the same time running an account that's hopefully catching the eye of all student athletes, not just the ones they're specifically targeting. And I think there's a lot across, especially on Twitter. We know how important direct messages and direct communication can be, but also kind of that one-to-many communication with video and graphics and all that fun stuff. So to answer your question, Blake, I think we're just getting started with this. And as we continue to see user behavior across all the different platforms, we'll continue to figure out where and how to reach individuals, but then also the larger kind of community as well.
And I think what's interesting, recruiting on Twitter with the DMs, it started really out of necessity because of the rules around texting, right? So the one great thing about the Twitter DM for coaches is it was unregulated. It was a way to stay in contact with kids at all times. And so it almost became this was the way that we could get to you. It was easier to find kids. It's much easier to find a kid's Twitter account and DM them, or Instagram account and DM them, than it was to track down their phone number, mom and dad's phone number. So it started with just the easiest and the one allowed direct contact. And then from there, it got the flashy graphics and the videos being put out, and just a very, very, again, a really effective tool of communication to get these same recruiting points out in a much more engaging fashion, or to a broader audience, or a way that that you could get to them. And then Blake and I've kind of touched on this, before this, but I think that what's really interesting to happen is the evolution and kind of next steps, but we'll get to that later.
And I think how David mentioned earlier as well, the ability to do stuff at scale now. The investment that these universities and colleges are making in their content teams to really create really great content, not just for themselves, but for their student athletes. Schools like Clemson, Michigan, Ohio State, University of Miami, and many, many more. Those are some that just come off the top of my head that have really made a concerted effort of really creating great content that grabs your attention and grabs people, that student athletes, it grabs prospective students, it grabs fans of the colleges, and could help them achieve multiple goals across the board and recruiting.
Now, one thing you mentioned in there, Vincent, with Clemson and Jonathan Gant, I've used this quote many times, and you guys have probably heard him say it too. I know that both Vince, you and David went down there to Clemson just this summer, but he talks about their job when it comes to social content is to show the world what it's like to be a Clemson Tiger, right? And when you put that at the center of everything, that does make it so that one-to-many effect, the same highlight that might attract the next recruit, also gets your season ticket holder excited for the upcoming season. It can get your current student athletes hyped up and feel that they're included in the story itself, and it can attract kids that want to go to school there. So I think putting that as the center, and I'll give Gant that shout out, is something more and more schools across the country is saying, like, we have limited resources. How do we create one piece of content that speaks to multiple audiences at a premium level that kind of is keeping up with the Joneses, as well as separating ourselves from competition? So I mean, Adam, I don't know if there's any questions that we have teed up that we can just roll right into, but you got anything rock and ready to roll? I got questions for days, Adam. Or he's going to mute himself. Look at that. All right. So actually, go ahead. No, here I got you, Adam. I'm just going to take over. Vince. One of the things, like you heard, let's talk about the Twitter, like as a platform serving like the direct message, like that's where a lot of this is living. But how is Instagram and Facebook interjecting in the the one-to-one relationship, I guess, between student athletes and coaches or schools?
I think it helps. It's one-to-one, but also at scale at the same time to a certain degree. The evolution of the story products on both Facebook and Instagram has been a great way for the athletic programs, but also coaches to start really kind of showing a peek behind the curtain. I think guys like Manny Diaz, Lincoln Riley do a really great job on Instagram as they are trying to reach the younger generations, knowing that that's where athletes are starting to consume their content. It's easy, low-hanging fruit for them to produce, but also it kind of creates that one-to-one feel of full screen content that they're used to consuming on a day-to-day basis.
I can see that. And from, I know that Zach being just a little bit removed from the three-stripe life, did you notice a difference in trying to communicate with the high school student athlete through the different platforms, like on the brand side, or what was your go-to?
I mean, like, without being too over the top with it, I mean, it was a game changer. We wouldn't have had the success that we had at Adidas and growing this and kind of creating this movement without social media. It allowed myself and Ryan and Shannon to not only communicate with kids directly, which was huge, right? We were able to get in contact with a receiver in Pennsylvania, a DB in Texas, a quarterback in Florida, right? It's the great, and it makes the world smaller. So that was great and easy, but it also, again, it allowed for that mass communication, right? Where I could send out one thing and get this rallying cry from kids from all over the country, the same way that a recruiting director will want to say, because with recruiting, what also happens now is the kids are way more involved in recruiting each other. And that's primarily through social media. That's how they're connecting. That's how they're sharing it. So for us, especially in the position of the challenger brand, it was something that people were ready to feel they could be a part of and ready to feel that they helped put us over the top. I mean, the craziest moment on social media for us when it comes to Adidas and the kids was when Adidas's stock price started going up, and you had kids celebrating Adidas's stock price on social media, and like for them to publicly display that, hey, we're part of this thing to that level, I'm like, it was crazy, and it really put it out there for everyone to see versus just a one-to-one communication. And I know we're going to get to this later, but also the influence that student athletes had on social media is insane. I mean, high school kids have as much, they can truly move product, honestly, in a way like NFL athletes can, and that's without a paid endorsement. That's just them doing it on their own, them taking it upon themselves to be within this movement.
Yeah, Zach, I think you brought up a really good point there. Something I've been thinking about a lot is this idea of the current student athletes university being more involved in recruiting, right? Where's the message coming from? Where's the source? It's one thing to have it come from the brand, the school account. But what better way to show off what the experience is at a university than by having the students who are at the center of that experience show it off for you? And I think we're starting to see that movement within schools a little bit more to allow student athletes to share. Obviously, there are concerns and there has to be conversations around doing that the right way. But I do think as a next step and looking further down the road, we're going to start to see athletes sharing more content. Obviously, we know that's what you are working on, Blake is working on, and it's going to be important to the process. So Vince and I, you mentioned Blake, Vince and I were both at Clemson, and kudos to them for putting us in front of the team and talking about if you're going to do it, here are things to think about in a positive way, but also here are the things you got to think about from the negative side also, and really just have a level set conversation of how to operate on social. And I think we're going to start to see a lot more of that as communication continues to become more one-to-one versus one-to-many.
I could not agree with that more. I mean, Blake knows I'm a firm believer in the work that they're doing and the ability to let the student athlete tell the message, right? Athlete driven, like Blake has all the numbers, right? We're talking like 7-to-1 engagement rate of the student athlete versus the team. And I think there's two things. One, it's more effective for the school to go through the student athlete. And I think that is, hey, they're going to get better results for what they want. But the other side of this now is kids want content. They want to go to a school that's going to build their brand. They want to go to a school that's going to help them grow their following, because they can't get paid while they're in school. but they can go to a school that's going to put them in the best position to monetize their value after they graduate. And if you're going to a school that's giving you premium content each week and letting you grow your following so that when you go to the draft or whatever it is that you're going to do, you're leaving school with a couple 100,000 followers, that's their way of setting you up for success in life.
Yep. One of the things I'll give a quick shout out, guys, from some of our partners, just getting creative with this concept. But on signing day, think about how signing day in college athletics has been that big celebration of creativity, of who is thinking outside the box to show the world their newest student athletes. And Clay Bollinger over at Tennessee, they pushed something where the moment that the facts came in, they handed each new incoming recruit a piece of content for them to tell the story about why they chose to go to Tennessee, and what those metrics showed was that story was more compelling than 25 different stories from the same thread, but 25 individuals introducing themselves to their new fan base for the first time. So some really creative approaches to early on, capitalizing on a relationship that from day one on campus to their last day of graduation, they are connected to that university in a different way, and content's becoming a way with the student athletes once they get on campus. And there's even more that's going at the campus, but while on campus, that's what we're seeing a lot of our partners really take that.
And I think another thing that you mentioned from a content standpoint, and I think you guys probably can all chime in on this, but I'll throw it to Zach from what's resonating with the recruits. What are these people looking for, right? You can do anything nowadays for the most part, but when you were at Adidas and doing your current stuff, what are they looking for? What do they want from these schools or from these teams or these organizations, camps?
Again, my biggest thing is just they want to feel a part of it, and letting you even see what these recruiting classes, the way they do, it's about joining something, committing to something. It's being this movement, right? The Surge 19, or, every school has their own thing that they give this class a name. There's a very common, they give them the hashtag, they give them the rallying cry. Because I think, look, kids are no different than we are really. People want to feel important. They want to feel bigger than themselves. And social media allows them to do that. So whether that's, it's not just giving them premium content, right? That's great. But it's, again, letting the kids tell the story for you. Let them be their ambassadors. Whether it's the kids who are already on campus or the kids who are their early commits, right? A lot of times you'll see the quarterback committed, 18 months to 2 years in advance, and let him lead it. Again, taking those graphics that you would usually have come from the school account, let the kids drive it for you. And it's amazing just the success that you'll see. And again, I think that's where, Clemson right now. So Clemson's recruiting class is not only #1 in the country, it's arguably the best of all time. And it started because it's so much of it is the kids buying in. Obviously, they have national championships and they have all these other things, but the kids are really helping each other. And hey, man, we got the best recruiting class ever. Why would you not want to be a part of this thing, right? And it's, you look at Brian Breeze on Twitter and DJ and all these kids, they're just as effective as Coach Sweeney is.
Awesome. And from a performance standpoint on the platforms, Vince, what are you guys seeing that performs the best? Is it the stories on Instagram? Is it video and feed? What are you guys kind of looking for?
It's a combination of both. It's not sticking to one of the product offerings. It's looking at everything that Facebook and Instagram have to offer and taking advantage of it. Looking at a holistic social strategy, cross-platform, across all platforms too, to see what performs best, what is driving engagement, what's driving interaction, ultimately what's driving the end result of what that athletic department, what that team, what that individual is looking for. There's no one answer in terms of saying, hey, this is what you should do to drive XYZ, because everyone's end goal is somewhat different. Maybe they're trying to drive tickets. Maybe they're trying to drive recruits. Maybe they're trying to get donations for their school. So saying that hey, there's one social strategy that's going to fit all isn't that. So it's really kind of honing down, saying what's that end result, and then building out your strategy and testing back and forth, looking at the data, seeing testing, constantly test, never fear to fail really on the platform, because the great thing is you can always come back with a new type of content the next day that switches things up. And really ultimately set goals for yourself and then benchmark yourselves against that. So whether it's stories, whether it's feeds, video content in feeds, direct messages, using Messenger, using Facebook groups. Those are all different product offerings that athletic departments, athletes, teams can look at as ways to bolster their brand.
Yeah, I think the other, from the Twitter side, I think one thing to keep in mind is that every user base is different, right? What's going to work for one account isn't necessarily going to work for another. And that's not a cop-out answer, I promise, when we get questions of, what works and what doesn't. It's true. We do see user behaviors on these different different followers act differently. What works for Ohio State might not work for Clemson, and vice versa, from a fan base perspective, but then also what they're seeing and the type of kids they're recruiting. So I think Ohio State does a great job across platforms of having content really fit each platform and each medium really well. A lot of folks are doing it. Ohio State stands out to me. They really have taken advantage of our short form video and just, when you're scrolling in the timeline, you really need that video to have something that makes you stop and look. And I think Ohio State really does a great job of grabbing that attention with a short form video, but also really strong motion graphics and visuals when there is information to share. Clemson, in only the way Clemson can, and their style of just fun and showcasing that culture, especially after wins and celebrations, is top notch. But I think combination of video, but then also staying relevant, and it's harder for college brands, right? Wendy's is the extreme. Not everyone can be Wendy's and have an account that's crazy at times. But Twitter is about what's happening. So I've been using this example for a while now. Apologies if anyone on the call has heard me say this like 6 times in the last month. But Game of Thrones, right? If you weren't talking about Game of Thrones from your account on Twitter, you were missing out on conversation. You're missing out on reaching people at scale. And we know your kids are talking about Game of Thrones, at least a portion of them, right? So thinking about the larger conversation buckets on Twitter and how to jump into those tastefully while also accomplishing your goals versus just doing it to do it, that's not an easy thing to figure out. And I don't know if anyone really has that answer, but that's what we're trying to work on and push, is not only focus on the visuals, but also the conversation that makes you just part of the larger Twitter community, which is
I think
important.
The one thing that, you're so right about is with colleges, more so than pro sports even, college teams are very, very unique brands, right? Ohio State is so different than Clemson, which is so different than USC versus Miami. And I think at first when schools started hopping on social media for recruiting, everyone was trying to be like 2 or 3 schools, right? It was all going to be about gear and flashiness and just highlight videos and not telling their unique story. And I think that's the biggest change now, is schools are understanding that, hey, if we're going to use social media, it needs to be authentically us and not just trying to keep up with the Joneses. Like Georgia Tech, I think this past couple months has done a great job. Like nobody else can embrace Waffle House and Young Jeezy. Right. So that's something that's so Atlanta, it's so Georgia Tech, and only they can do it. And it differentiates them both within the ACC and even, the University of Georgia can't do it. They're in Athens, not Atlanta. So I think, making sure that you're telling authentic stories for you that nobody else can tell.
One thing that I do want to get your guys' take on this, and this is something that if you're tuned in, you work in college athletics, ideally, you leave this with some really great ideas on new things to try. But then you're going to go back to the same question of like, how the hell do we do all this all at once? Because there's so many channels now, from coaches to student athletes to alumni to administrators to your own channels, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about best practices in being the most effective at feeding so many different channels at once. And this is not an Opendorse plug. It's literally not.
The answer is Opendorse.
Yeah, but just that's the secret. No, but there's even if you don't use Opendorse or use a tool, I saw that Tori's on the line here from Oklahoma, and one of the best practices that we saw was during training camp, during fall camp last year. They would take B-roll footage, which would be B-roll. Like it's just a video of a guy making a catch in warm-ups that would never make sense to share on the Oklahoma feed. Wouldn't make sense to share on really anyone's feed. But for the guy that makes a catch in slow-mo, it's a 6-second clip, bite size. It's going to loop in the feed, becomes super valuable. And they did this every day of camp. They had different student athletes that on the football team, and they were on average getting 15 times more video views than they had followers. So student athletes with 10,000 followers were getting 150,000 views on videos. And it just kind of fed this beast of an audience that is craving more content from more channels. And I just think there's a creative approach to content that normally wouldn't make the highlight of the day, like wouldn't make the video, right? So how have you guys seen examples like that of somebody with limited resources effectively feeding the beast, if you will?
I'll take a step back from that. I think in the college space, especially, we're still very far behind from executives and those in kind of staffing power of understanding what resources are needed. And that's going to have to change at some point. The way things work now with the 1, 2, 3-man shows, if that, right? There's no way that can continue if these programs want to compete. We know that in football it's changing, but it'll change in other sports as well at the athletic department level. So I think at some point we're going to have that shift from a staffing perspective that schools are going to be able to crank out more content for all those resources. Until then, tools and resourcing is huge. I think there are a couple things to think about. I don't think anyone across leagues, teams, college or pro, takes advantage of kind of reposting and resharing enough, right? There is nothing wrong on our platform, right, with a quote tweet or share media or kind of where the attribution is there, sharing content that already exists on the platform. I think for some reason there's a little stigma around that, but it's totally acceptable to do, especially when you don't have the bandwidth, right? And that's obviously simple and easy. Tools like Opendorse and others are great. And in some ways needed, given how much, from a student athlete perspective, there needs to be. I think there's also one key here we haven't talked about is the relationship the SID has with their student athletes, or whether it's the SID or anyone else on their staff, of sharing one-to-one. I mean, text messaging and sending and emailing, all that is annoying, but we know it happens, right? And that relationship between those who hold the content and the student athletes is critical. So I still think there's an element of that kind of one-off casual sharing that is resulting in a lot of content being posted as well. So it's not a great answer, but I think, staffing is going to have to change, but also don't be afraid to take advantage of the really low-hanging fruit, simple ways to share content. While it may not be the best solution, it's still getting content to where it needs to go.
And Blake, to your point, it doesn't need to be this ultra premium, super highly edited with graphics and transitions. If a kid makes a good play in practice, make sure to get him that clip and let him share it. It's gonna, especially from the student athletes accounts, right? I mean, we're talking about 19-year-old kids. This doesn't need to meet every single, brand standard and best practice that you have for your school. If it's gonna perform well, it's gonna put your school in a positive light. It's gonna put the student athlete in the positive light. I think people get too sensitive about what they're willing to see, what they're willing to let see the light of day. And if you have content, just share it. It's gonna grow, even if it doesn't really meet an objective because it's just a good play for that kid. It's going to help grow their following. So when you have them post something that is going to meet one of your objectives, they have a bigger audience to reach.
Yep. Yes. Speaking from my time with the Dolphins too, that was one thing that we always made a concerted effort doing after every training camp practice or game was to get content into the hands of our players, because that's where fans are going to consume the content. They follow the athletes because that's their favorite wide receiver, favorite quarterback, favorite running back, favorite DB. They want to see what that athlete's doing, and if we could supply them with content that our photographers took or if our videographers caught a really good clip, we wanted to make sure that they had stuff there to help grow their personal brands, but it was also a representation of our own brand too, to extend that reach further and further. So it got to the point where the athletes would then be asking us when we didn't get them photos or content soon enough, where their photos were every day after practice.
Right.
Or why aren't there more photos of me after practice to get? And it was, it's one of the things where they understand because they're going through this whole process of when they're in high school, especially the younger athlete, from a professional standpoint, whether they were first couple years in the league where they were used to having content creators around them at all times in college. They're used to going to the camps and clinics growing up when they were younger. In high school, like it's a natural progression for them where they're just used to this nature of content and producing content and distributing content at all times.
And one thing we talk about is that if they're not getting it from the team, then they're getting it from somewhere, right? Like there's a publisher that's driving their DMs. There's somebody that made an edit like on their own and they're sliding right in. And they're going to share the content from somewhere, right? And there's one path to helping team up on that narrative, and it's like collaborating on it. But if you're not providing, then they're going to get it from somewhere. And that, I guess, go ahead, Dave.
No, I was going to say, this is just more of a thought that popped up. I think on the pro side, we're also seeing the leagues take more of an initiative here, right? The rights holders, if you will, where we're not necessarily seeing that on the college side from the conference level, at least at scale, right? And I think that's an interesting dynamic too, from not only a staffing perspective, but the type of content that's being shared, right? If you're a league and you have highlight rights to pass to your athletes, great. That's different on the college side, and how conferences and, we'll throw ESPN in there. How is ESPN getting involved in this stuff as well? I think is going to be interesting as we move down the road. As we all know, the college landscape from a rights perspective is nothing but a jumbled mess, and it's complicated. And I think that results in folks having to get extra creative as a result of what they either don't have access to or those in power do not sharing that appropriately. So it's an interesting one.
At risk of there's no call outs or anything like that, but the conference to student athlete relationship is different than league to, professional athlete. Compliance gets involved a lot in those conversations, and it just gets scary, right? For social media managers, like, hey, I want to send this highlight to this kid that's on campus because it was amazing, right? He was his best game ever. But we know schools sit there and say that they don't have the rights to share this on their own channel, but if their student athletes share it, like, what happens then? And those questions pop up, and what's interesting is we see conferences retweeting and sharing when student athletes share highlights that they pulled from YouTube or from a source, right? And it just becomes interesting because the same content that resonates with the audience cannot be shared through the team account, but can be shared through the student athlete or alumni or something of that sort. So it's just an interesting time in terms of premium content in the feed and rights management, as well as navigating the internal discussions with compliance about pushing content to student athletes in general. So
and I think another point or thought, and I think, Zach, from your standpoint, this is probably a good one, and then even from a platform standpoint is, Zach, how can maybe the people who don't have as much resources or are trying to maximize their resources leverage like the apparel partners like an Adidas or a Nike? Obviously, a lot of times these content have the Adidas logo, the Nike logo built into it. So from your time there, how are they leveraging you? And then, David and Vince on your side, like from a platform standpoint, what can they leverage you guys and your relationships and what you guys have on the back end on Facebook and Twitter side to maybe help them when they don't have an extra intern or they don't have an extra social employee that, maybe you guys can be that person. So I'll let Zach kind of run with that first.
I think one thing that, for schools, anyone who's working at an athletic department, I would encourage you to reach out to whoever your brand rep is. And, even if it's just the person who's managing the equipment, they can put you in touch with somebody from the brand or marketing or comm side. I mean, obviously Nike and Oregon have a very special relationship. So when I was working, Drew, I know, is on this, and a couple other Oregon folks. When we wanted to launch the Oregon Gridiron site and social media, I mean, it was one-to-one meetings sitting in there with the Nike brand team. At the time, it was Robert Griesinger and a lot of really, really smart people helped us do that. And I know on the Adidas side, it's the same way, that anytime a school was going to reach out to us, we wanted to do anything we could to help them tell their story. I mean, these apparel companies are investing millions and millions of dollars into these universities. So anything that we can do, if you're talking about a comms manager spending a few extra hours to help that school create content, publish content, and help the brand get the best ROI for that investment, they'll do it all day long.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And the thing I was on the road at, I don't know, like 10 schools last fall. It was a big spending time on campus. You equipment folks as well, and how you start to understand how big of a component, for me at least, it was a bit of an unknown of how big of a component that really is. And I think the brands, we were with Jeff from Nike out at Clemson, and a couple other folks that I've talked to. I think the brands are waiting for schools to say, yes, can we integrate more in your content on social, right? And how can we be more of a part of putting great content out together? So I do think there's a lot of untapped opportunity from the apparel side, just because of how important that is to the students coming in, also the students that are there showing off the gear that they have. That's huge. But also from a content planning perspective, if the goal is to create FOMO, which in often cases that is for a recruit, right? There's no better way to do that than with cool gear. And we'll continue to see that moving forward. I think from the Twitter side, the second part of your question, I think it's tough. I don't want to speak for Vince, but we get questions all day long that we'll try and do our best to help. Where it gets complicated is one, the information that we don't have in terms of what resources do you have as a school. We can suggest all day long, but we're not in your program and don't know what you have access to and what you don't. I think where we can help, at least from my side on the Twitter side, is helping you understand our platform, so that based off of the resources you have and the access that you have, figure out how to maximize. And I'll never tell someone you should tweet about this or tweet about that, but we could talk for a day about what video is going to perform better, or what type of content or conversation is going to perform better. But it'll start from like the understanding of all of the schools are different and have access to different things, and that inherently makes it tricky for us on the platform side to kind of have that one standard that applies to everyone, because naturally it won't.
The one thing on the resource side that I run into with schools that always shocks me is a lot. I mean, nowadays with camera, like there's so many really, really talented kids at each of these colleges, right? You have students who are so good at photo and video that if schools just gave them access, right? You don't even need to worry about hiring these kids into a full-on internship program. Just say, hey, yes, you can come shoot practice once a week, but we own the content and you can share it. Just let them in the door. I mean, there were certain schools of ours, Adidas schools, that I struggled with, where I knew really, really, really talented kids that were either on campus or recent grads who just wanted to help, and they wouldn't let them do it because they're so protective of the brand and letting people in and secrecy and everything. I mean, but like, again, if you can't, to me, it's like you can't have it both ways. You don't get to complain about resources and then deny 3 videographers access to practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
yep.
From like the branding standpoint too, I think the one thing that's getting interesting more with the apparel brands too is like the lines of the verticals are blurring more and more from, a traditional sports brand to being a lifestyle brand, influencing music being more and more of an influence there as well, which just allows you to play in so many different spaces than you have in the past. And like David mentioned too, like from a Facebook and Instagram standpoint, we're here to assist any way that we can, but not knowing what resources you have does make it a little bit harder. But we're here happy to help to provide best practices and figure out ways that you could hopefully find a roadmap for you to achieve your goals on the platform.
One thing, sorry to jump in, just I want to make sure, because I know we're going to get a question on it, so I just want to address it real quickly before. Obviously, it's been a crazy week for suspensions and copyright violations on Twitter, as the folks in this grouping know well. So let's take 30 seconds to kind of address that from my perspective, just to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page. Obviously, it's very simple from a rule perspective on Twitter. If you don't own it, don't use it. We're different than Facebook and Instagram and YouTube in that regard, who have some other options when it comes to music. On Twitter, if you don't have the rights, it's really the best practice is don't use it. That doesn't mean there are great places, APM, other music services, where you can buy really great music that'll get the job done. But be careful. It's the copyright holder's discretion of when, how, why they're going to flag music, whether that's in the background of something or you're using a Drake song that obviously isn't gonna fly out in the open. But just be careful from going back and looking at old tweets. That yes, it's a pain. Use Twitter advanced search. Put in a date range. If you think, hey, we had someone here at this time who did this type of thing with their videos, go look at those. Get rid of them if you think they're an issue. But we're here to help when these issues come about. Unfortunately, it's kind of a legal process, so there's not a ton we can do. But we'll happily guide where we can. But just be careful, because we don't want to get back into a situation like we have been in the past few weeks.
And the one thing that I think people forget is if they actually can find a way to have contact with an artist or with a label, if you reach out to them and say, hey, can we get the clearance to use some of these songs for free? Like we just did this past week for the quarterback retreat. Young Thug has a new song that comes out with J. Cole and Travis Scott. Was able to make a connection to 300, their label, and said, hey, can we use this song, right? You're talking about student athletes who are not profiting off of this in any way. There's no commercialization. It's just these kids like the song and they want to be able to use it in a highlight video of themselves. They said, absolutely, use that song, properly credit it, and we'll whitelist it, make sure you're okay. Again, there is like mutual, it can be mutually beneficial for an artist or for other content creators, that as long as you're giving proper attribution and you get clearance, everybody can help. Don't just go and steal it on the side.
Yep. There's one thing on this that we see just being focused on the faces, right? Like there's people sharing content, and what artists want are people to share their media. But when organizations share it, then there's a lot of compliance issues there. So again, if Lil Nas, if I want to sing that song like every it's stuck in my head. But if Lil Nas sees Kyler Murray share a video with that song in it, like that's his goal, is to get guys like Kyler Murray to share his song, versus if the Cardinals OU shared it, then there's getting a cease and desist, right? So like understanding that the cultural integration is a lot easier when it's coming from a person, not a property account. Along with that, there's still, if you're on the fence, like the cease and desist goes to whoever published it, right? So if you're pushing a content to a coach or a student athlete and they get a cease and desist, like they're the ones that are liable for them publishing it, depending on which method you use to share it with them.
Definitely. And I know we have some pro people on here too. So I kind of want to touch on I would say the whole funnel, right? So from recruit to college to pro, how are we maximizing across that? And I know, Blake, you have some probably thoughts on that. Everyone probably has some thoughts on that, but I would like to, make sure we're kind of hitting those people who are in the pros and the NFL and EA and stuff like that, as where they can take some learnings away from something like this, where it's like, okay, how can the pro athletes either connect back to the schools or vice versa, keeping the line of connection going? I think just tossing that up for consideration before we get into some questions here would be a good ender. Yeah,
I think the NFL has been leading the way here from a social perspective. Elliot Grossman, AJ on their social team, Dave Feldman, they've really spent a lot of time thinking about how to connect back with universities, leading up to things like the draft, the combine, but then also once these guys are in the pros, like these athletes have a following from their school, a really dedicated one. Why wouldn't, as a pro team, want that audience who's a fan of that player to now be a fan of your team and engage with your content? So I think there is a funnel there, and I think pro teams overall probably don't look back or don't connect back with that college fan base of their star student athletes or their star athletes or any athlete in general. But I think leagues are starting to think about this more. Let's use Zion example coming up here in the draft. There isn't any Zion NBA content right now. There's still plenty of Zion Duke content. There's still a couple months between the draft and the first game of the season. Whoever, assuming it'll be New Orleans, whoever that team is, you bet they're going to try it. They should, and they will kind of go after and engage with Duke content, because that's what's available and that's where an already established fan base is. So I think it's super important, the funnel, and I think we need to see more of that from both sides, colleges and on the pro team and the league side.
One on that, like that is where the roots of working in college athletics for Opendorse started, was with alumni, and we know that about 30% of a pro athlete's audience is from their college. Like that's where they develop that audience. So that's an opportunity for the schools to connect with pros and bring them back. We do a lot of schools do like the Throwback Thursdays and really keeping that voice alive. But that means that 70% of the audience they're reaching university, right? So when you're teaming up with alumni, you're able to leverage somebody that's the most authentic ambassador, talking about showing the world what it's like to be a Clemson Tiger or a Nebraska Cornhusker. Like those guys can tell the story. So teaming up with them, reach a different, for the pro level, it also allows them to represent us, connect back to that audience. So there's to a certain percentage of audience. And it works, and we see more.
Yeah, that college fan base is going to be your fan for life. Once you get to the pros, you might be on a team for 10 years, you might be on a team for 1 year. So if you bounce around from team to team, those followers may come and go, but your college fan base is going to be sticking with you probably long after your playing days are done. So it's never too early to start building your brand while you're there, and then looking at it into the next 40 to 60 years down the line of what you can do to go back to your college and benefit off that for the long term.
And again,
how did you guys at the Dolphins kind of maximize that, since you're the only one on the panel with like a pro social experience?
Working with the NFL, working with Elliott, we did have collaborations around draft to share content with the colleges when people were during the draft period. So figuring out ways that we could cross post or share or make sure we're amplifying content from the colleges, or vice versa, colleges amplifying content from us. And trying to figure out if there was ever players going back to their colleges, sometimes highlighting that, figuring out ways if there was any connections. We had the last couple of years there, we had a lot of Ohio State players on the team. I think there's even more Ohio State players on the team now. So talking about the Ohio State connections, drawing that fan base in a little bit closer. Trying to play off of some of the euphemisms that maybe Ohio State did up there to try to relate back to what they're doing now in the pros. But ultimately, it's like sitting down with those athletes too, once they're with the team, and trying to say like, hey, here's ways that you can re-engage with your former teams. Same thing like working with like Ndam Kinsu when he was with the Dolphins, tapping back into his Nebraska fan base, putting something out there to kind of always tap back into the audience, because remind people it's like, hey, I was here, like still part of your family, and want to be welcome.
I think the teams. I mean, when you're the Dolphins, you guys do a great job. But and teams like especially these diehard fan bases that don't have a local NFL team, Washington team name, which I won't say, they have a lot of Alabama players. There is no Alabama NFL team, so they can. I mean, they have like they're like 8 starters that went to Bama. So just they should have a very good connection with that school. And now all of a sudden you turn Bama fans into Washington football fans. Mm-hmm. I think that's I think teams, again, people get so sensitive about their IP, their content, instead of reaching out and sharing and growing their audiences together and having these mutually beneficial relationships. On the Adidas side, our best practices for doing anything with a college was using our signed athletes that were alumni of those schools, right? So if you do something with Miami, you use Jimmy Graham. If you do something with Arizona State this year, I guarantee you that N'Keal Harry will be a part of that, right? And using these people who are popular in their fan bases to tell that story on the pro side and on the brand side is the best way to connect back, right? Everyone has that nostalgia, depending on how far back you want to go.
Definitely. Awesome. Now we'll jump into some questions. There's one in the chat, and Zach, since you were just talking about it, from Mose, it says, how do you think define premium content? To me, there's a battle happening between creators who want to push polished high-level concepts and managers who see an organic highlight outperform everything else by 10x.
So to me, I love this question, because I think that premium doesn't need to be defined as shot on the best camera or highly edited, or premium is what's right for that channel. So something that goes on the athlete channel doesn't need to be shot on a red. And, you know, it's like people get so caught up with that I think, yeah, it's premium isn't premium. Premium is effective. And that's what matters most. So if it's going on the Student Athletes channel, it can be iPhone quality.
It's better be raw. Yeah, it's better. Yeah.
Look at Overtime. Overtime has built a massive business on iPhone shooters. It's incredible. Like that, like authenticity is the key, and something that's right for that consumer, right for that audience should be way more important than overly produced.
And on that, just to say, when you think about the daily practice, even if you have one photographer that you have access to, they might take 500 photos at practice. Like Vince, think about your time at the Dolphins. And you got to filter that down and maybe show like 20 or maybe 10 that you post to the website and maybe 4 to social. And that means that 95, 99% of the content you capture is doing nothing. That's where we see a lot of people saying, well, what if I got 40% utilization of my content by just putting it in other channels, right? So then the conversation is being threaded through the coaches, through the admins on campus. You know, we see people with athletic directors sharing photos from a volleyball practice, right? Like this is fantastic stuff. And then student athletes getting involved in it. So I just see that as that doesn't need to be touched up. It's actually better if it's not. Like it just seems as if it's the natural way that people use social media. Like properties are in a place where the expectation is premium, but people, the expectations for people sharing content on social is so low, especially athletes and student athletes. So
they're amateurs, right? We're talking about amateur athletics. Let them, they can share whatever. Like these kids, they want the content, like the student athletes themselves want it, and their followers are hungry for it. It doesn't, like, just give them something decent and let them run with it.
Yeah, I think there's, and I said this, I was speaking at the SVG College Summit yesterday, and we talked about this a little bit. I think there's, you know, in a place where, again, we're talking about resources and folks are going in and asking for these expensive cameras and equipment. I do think they're needed at times, right? But if you ask me, am I going to spend $30K on a camera lens setup or $30K, a couple interns in here and create content? You're going to get the same answer every time, which is let's create more content. And I think there's ultimately places for both. You know, on Twitter, we always talk about the audience is most receptive when something is happening, right? You have won a game. You now have a window of opportunity to take advantage of the audience at their most receptive point. If you're not getting a video out in that time because you're spending time editing it in the back because of the super fancy camera, you've missed your window, right? Now, that's not saying people aren't doing a great job of having, you know, prepared segments and things that are super high quality and great that look good in the timeline that are awesome. But if you are one or the other at one or the other extreme, I'm going to lead towards getting that iPhone video out in the moment when it's going to be most receptive to the audience. With that being said, I do think, I mean, let's talk, for me, South Carolina is some of the best video in the college game from like a cinematic produced standpoint. It's awesome. I want to be part of South Carolina when I see those videos. But those are sprinkled in features to me versus the always on strategy. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of differences there. But from a Twitter perspective, that moment of receptivity and that moment of conversation is so important. You have to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think it's a balance of both, and trying to figure out whether you're doing things that are very scrappy all the way up to extremely high polished video. It's knowing what's right at the right time, and timeliness is obviously a key importance to all of that, to get stuff out when it's a moment of excitement and there's no time. But it's also trying to figure out ways to maybe make that little scrappier video a little bit more polished, whether it's like obviously shooting stuff on your iPhone, but looking at apps that can throw a watermark on it, or put a little end card, or Adobe apps that could throw a little transition slide in there. There's ways that you could make very scrappy content feel a little bit more premium and still get it out in close to real time, and trying to figure out ways that you enable more people within your organization to create content than have been able to before, where on a game day we'd have cameras all over the field. By cameras, I mean cell phones creating content on a consistent basis, whether it be pregame or postgame, knowing that that was some of the content that we were probably going to turn around the fastest, and was kind of a stopgap until we had time to have more produced pieces go out. And some of those more produced pieces don't get out until the next morning. So it's easy to kind of get it in and just produce quick and fast, but also knowing to play off the timeliness of that nature. And
again, I know there's probably a decent amount of people listening here or watching on here that are responsible for ticket sales. I don't know about you guys, but my favorite ticket commercial, I can't remember, it was like StubHub or Ticketmaster or somebody like that. They did the commercial. All they did was show different iPhone videos of the same play, right, from different sections in the stadium, and basically saying like, look, it doesn't matter where you are, it's still incredible. And like, you get chills watching this. And this was a national TV commercial that was just iPhone footage, right? So if you get creative with it and you combine it in unique and interesting ways, you can tell your story without really expensive equipment. And going back to, again, the intern resources, most of these college interns don't even need to be paid, or they're being paid less than minimum wage. Like, let people in their building, let them help, right? If they cause problems, get them out of the building, but at least give these people an opportunity to help your brand, help tell your story, and help accomplish the objectives that you're doing. Because people in college athletics, they work insane hours. Like, I'll be honest, people at Oregon football work significantly more hours in a day and in a week than people at Adidas. And that's just how it is. And these college cultures, because of the coaches and recruiting and sports, like, you have these, even the marketing folks are in there working 80, 90, 100 hours a week. Just let some of these kids help.
Yeah, and then from our standpoint, there's another question here too. I think we've kind of danced around it, but from a college coaching standpoint, even just like a professional coaching standpoint, I don't know if some of these best practices, Steve Kerr is pretty active on Twitter from a professional standpoint. Convincing these coaches to be more active, best practices from these coaches to be more active. Manny Diaz stirring up a whole lot of Twitter conversation by tweeting a cyclone, right, or a hurricane, right? So from that standpoint, like, how can the coaches themselves be the biggest advocates realistically?
And just from our partners are being so creative with this across the country, is that they saw this challenge where it's like the coaching staff are the ones that are using and recruiting and sharing the story and developing these one-on-one relationships. And they would set up a Dropbox folder or set up a whole library of content and like pray the coaches used it. And that just didn't happen. So we see a lot of our partners that are just teeing up content, because the other extreme is like coaches giving up their credentials to their social channels and not knowing what's being posted. So then when they see a recruit, they're like, hey, that video was dope. Like, what video are you talking about? So the coaches want control, but they need to have it like teed up for them. And so like our partners are basically pushing content to their coaches. And then what we've seen is when they are like using our tool to, have coaches just publish at the click of a button, then the coaches, they start to get it. It's like training, right? It's like you create these training wheels, like, hey, do this, hey, do this, hey, do this. And then they start doing it on their own, and then they can focus on another coach. So it's been a pretty cool thing. It's like teeing things up for coaches versus like, hey, please do this, because a lot of this is like that, I get older, they stay the same age thing. Like, coaches are getting older and the technology is changing what the student athletes are using. So we've seen that.
Yeah, this may not be a popular opinion, but I'm of the belief that if a coach isn't interested, don't force it. It's not worth the risk of, Blake said, of the coach, the voice of the coach not coming across on the channel that someone else is running for him, the unknowns of what's happening, and really having someone to trust to do that effectively. Let's look at, Coach Swinney, Coach Saban, like, they're not going to have a social platform. We know that, right? That makes sense. That's their brand. That's who they are. There's nothing wrong with that. I think oftentimes there's a conversation of, let's get these coaches on, let's get them on, but let's get them to understand, not have them get on. And I think that's a big piece of education, right? Let them understand of why we need to do it as a school, but in no way, shape, or form do we need you to be part of this. And I think that's important. To call out, because there is no reason to force it. If it's not authentic, to me, it's detrimental. It's not adding anything. And I think that comes across very easily. Let's look at Lincoln Riley's account. And he's very engaged on Twitter individually, but also has Zach on his crew, Zach Heffley, who's fantastic. And they have this trust and this understanding of how how his channel is going to work and what it is for and what it is not for. I think that's rare. We don't see that as much, especially on the football level as high. We do have some coaches who are incredibly active, those on the younger side, and it's awesome. But it's different. And it has to fit. I'm sure it's the same for Instagram as well. Maybe even more so on the Instagram side.
Yeah, it's got to be. It has to be authentic. So if it's stretching too far and not coming off as real, or not coming off their personality, or not relaying the message that they wanted to see, then it's not doing them a service. So I think what we're going to see too is, like, as the younger coaches continue to come in, and they've been growing up in the social media world, I think, and they've been using it as, whether just as their social platforms or used it as they were players or student athletes, and now transitioning into the coaching world, I think we'll start seeing coaches being more and more active on the platform, understanding that's where a lot of their potential recruits and potential future student athletes are.
And the trust factor that David talked about is so important, right? So even if a coach doesn't necessarily want to use the social media all the time themselves, if they have somebody on staff who they trust to do it for them, that, hey, this is a firm understanding of what the coach's brand is going to be, what the coach's voice is going to be, and that, hey, this person can use it, right? Whether or not they're just posting natively or going through Opendorse, so the coach can actually hit approve of each thing. I think, it's a way harder in the pros to me because there's no recruiting. For college, it makes sense because recruiting is the lifeblood of the program. The coach being active on social media oftentimes will impact recruiting. People want to see that. So just, even if you don't want to use it yourself, let somebody else do it for you. Again, just to Georgia Tech, again, like Jeff Collins and Morpheus, they got their brand manager who's really doing this for them and create an identity for Coach Collins, for the program. When you look at again, Clemson, Oklahoma, all these people that are, at this point, to me, and I've said this to Blake before, the content creator, the content team, the brand team for the school, I look at like a position coach, right? It's something that's going to help the team win, and this person provides value, and let them do it and trust them to, the same way that you trust your DB coach to teach a corner how to backpedal, trust your social team to run that for you and help the team win.
Yeah, I think that's a great call. I mean, the team at Alabama does an amazing job with this, and Jonathan King and his crew, of like understanding what their brand is, trusting that, and they're looked at, they're embedded in the building, right? They are an extension of the team, and those are the folks that are doing it successfully. Obviously, sometimes that can get siloed out too much, but you have to be embedded. You have to be considered as a part of the group to be able to effectively communicate what that brand is. And we talk about access all the time, but it really is important because you can't be authentic without the access. The inability to get in is maybe the most inauthentic thing that could possibly happen on social. So.
Awesome. And then as we finish up here, guys, we're running up against the hour. It's amazing how quick it comes. But one thing that you're either looking forward to or you would like to see change either in the next year, 2 years, or 3 years. Blake, I'll start with you. You look like you're thinking pretty hard.
No, I'm all thinking really hard. I'm trying to think if Vince ever saw a skinny white linebacker number 40 in those Ndamukong Suh, Nebraska highlights. I'm pretty sure that was the highlight. David, you mentioned something earlier about the conferences and the video highlight rights as an untapped opportunity in sports, is increasing distribution of collegiate highlights on social with a stronger structure. So I look to see more conferences have a real conversation about increasing the distribution of highlights on social by thinking outside of the standard channels. So that's something I think is a good takeaway from this conversation.
Cool. David?
Yeah, I alluded earlier. I think there are a couple of things in the next couple of years I think that are important. One, the dynamic of resourcing has to change. It's not sustainable, and at some point there's someone is going to set a precedent to standardize resources for digital, for social across the board, and I think we'll get there at some point. Number two, is continued focus on what works for the platforms, right? Vince and I have talked about this when we were at Clemson and talked about it with Nick Marquez on his team. There's so many great ways to put content out on all platforms that works for all platforms. And I think we're People are doing a much better job of this, but we're going to continue to see it as we move along here. And the number 3 is, like I mentioned before, the best way to showcase a brand is by have those who are most involved in it do it for you, and that's the student athlete. And I think we're going to see more coaches and more of a deliberate effort to, direct their student athletes. That's may sound a little bit harsh, but in some ways really give more direction. Help us showcase this brand. Help us showcase why you are here and what you love about it. So I think those 3 things are what I'm looking forward to, and we'll look to see as we move forward.
Vince, how about you?
I'm excited to see how much the sports community is going to become in the upcoming years. Just knowing that you'll now with all of these platforms, you have unprecedented access to teams, athletes, leagues like never before. Knowing that in the past, you might be only be able to meet maybe your hero once in a lifetime, or maybe never meet your hero. Now there's a possibility of you having a one-to-one interaction with them on these platforms at any given moment, and having a peek behind the curtain of what's going on in their lives. So when used to be only be seen on TV or in big features, can now be on a daily basis, where whatever athlete wants to share. So knowing that the connectedness and developing fans for an entire life is going to be just so much easier. It's exciting to see what direction that's going to take and what influence an athlete and teams and leagues are going to have in the upcoming years.
So Taco Tuesday with LeBron, right?
Exactly. Taco Tuesday. And Bronny.
Bronny, yeah. Who has more Instagram followers than some teams already. And then Zach, for you?
So I kind of touched on this earlier, and off of David's point of the schools directing kids to post, I actually look at it almost the opposite. I think what you're going to start to see now, and you actually are starting to see it, kids are openly admitting it and talking about and asking schools these questions, is what are you going to do to build my brand? What are you going to do to build my following? And I think that, in maybe not today or tomorrow or, but some point, that if you're a school that's not providing your student athletes content and the resources to build their social followings, and right, because you can't pay the kids, but you can absolutely help them maximize their earning potential when they do go pro. And if you're not doing that, I think you're doing your kids a disservice. So I think that's the thing that I think will be most interesting, is not just the schools wanting to push it out to get their message, but kids actually, it's an expectation. It's almost a demand. It's if I'm going to go here, you got to give me my own highlights. I want to post it. I want to control the message. I want the followers, right? I'm going to help you sell tickets. You better help me at least grow my following.
Awesome. Well, that's a good way to end it. Again, appreciate you guys a lot for joining us, spending the last hour here. And then for everyone who joined us in the chat, thanks again for jumping in. This will be recorded and sent to all of you guys. So if you want to rewatch it, if you want to share it with people, there'll be probably an email in the next 10 minutes that they'll get it. But again, just wanted to thank Blake and David and Vince and Zach for joining us. And hopefully everyone was able to glean a couple things out of it here before the weekend. And it's a beautiful day in New York, so hopefully it's a beautiful day where you guys are and you can enjoy some good second weekend of summer action. So thanks again, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.